The night was winding down as the plane touched down softly on the tarmac at LAX, California. Charles Reed let out a quiet sigh of relief, one barely perceptible to anyone around him in the nearly empty first-class cabin. A nearly 5-hour flight from Washington, D.C. had been far longer than expected due to an emergency briefing he had to attend, and now, after weeks of political and national security meetings, all he wanted was to get home and find some peace. His schedule was always hectic, but tonight he was looking forward to the rare quiet that came when he was alone. He had no entourage, no security detail in tow, just him and his leather briefcase, a symbol of his decades of service and leadership in law enforcement. Charles Reed, in his mid-50s, still carried the tall, lean frame of someone who had spent a lifetime in the trenches of national security and law enforcement. His neatly trimmed salt and pepper hair was a testament to his years of experience, and though his face showed some wear, his eyes were sharp, perceptive, scanning the world around him with a professional's gaze. He wore a simple black suit that fit just right, and a dark tie that had loosened slightly from the long flight. To an outsider, he appeared as any other busy man, traveling for work, with an air of authority but never seeking attention. That was how he liked it, unnoticed, quiet, efficient. He carried only a small briefcase, no checked luggage, a habit that saved time and minimized risk when he was on personal or confidential business. And it worked. No one paid attention to him, just another face in the crowd as he disembarked from the plane. But as he quietly made his way toward the gate for his connecting flight, something felt different. He could sense the energy around him shift. As he passed through the terminal, he didn't notice anything unusual at first, but then he caught sight of them. 2 Los Angeles police officers standing near gate B12, scanning the crowds, their eyes moving over every face. It was a normal enough sight at any major airport, but there was something about the way their eyes landed on him, something that felt off. Charles didn't think much of it at first. After all, he was a man used to being under scrutiny, having spent his life in leadership roles where attention was always part of the deal. But as he passed by the 2 officers, he noticed the way they shifted their focus. Their eyes lingered a moment too long, their judgmental expressions turning in his direction. He could see their brief glance of suspicion, then a quick exchange between them, an almost imperceptible nod. "Sir, stop!" one of the officers called out sharply, his voice harsh, cutting through the air. Charles stopped immediately, his posture stiffening. He had encountered situations like this before, being stopped by law enforcement, singled out because of who he was or where he came from, but this time was different. There was an immediate, unsettling sense of discomfort in the air. The officer who had spoken, Officer John Miller, was a man in his 40s, his tired eyes betraying years of service but also a growing cynicism. His partner, Officer Sean Davis, was younger, in his late 20s, still carrying the nervous energy of someone less experienced, but no less eager to prove himself. Charles stood there, unfazed but attentive, already instinctively sizing up the situation. He had learned long ago to read people, to assess danger before it had a chance to escalate. "Is there a problem, officers?" Charles asked, his voice calm and even. He wasn't angry, he was just asking, as he always did in these situations. But his words, his calmness, seemed to have the opposite effect on Officer Miller. The officer's eyes narrowed, his posture shifting slightly in a way that spoke more to arrogance than authority. "We have a report of a suspicious person," Miller said gruffly, his eyes scanning Charles once more. "Can I see your ID?" Charles, still composed, didn't answer right away. He could feel the heat rising in the air, the growing tension. This wasn't just a routine stop. He could sense their discomfort, their immediate suspicion. He wasn't even sure why they had singled him out. His clothes, the briefcase, the way he carried himself. But nothing about his presence screamed threat. "I'm not sure I understand," Charles replied smoothly, his voice laced with a slight edge, now sensing the subtle hostility. "What exactly is the problem, officer? What's the nature of this suspicious activity you're referring to?" Miller's face tightened, as if he didn't like being questioned. His response was terse, almost dismissive, as if he had already made up his mind about Charles. "We don't need to explain ourselves," Miller snapped, stepping closer to Charles than necessary, trying to assert his dominance. "Just show your ID, or we'll have to escalate this." Charles stood firm. He wasn't intimidated. He knew the law, and he knew his rights. "I'll gladly show my identification," he said, but his tone remained calm and controlled. "However, I believe I am entitled to understand the reason for being stopped. I'm not here to waste anyone's time." His words were measured, but they carried the weight of someone who knew exactly what was going on. The tension in the air thickened. Officer Miller's gaze hardened, but it was Officer Davis who spoke up, trying to add weight to Miller's orders. "You're on some sort of mission, aren't you?" Davis asked, his tone accusatory. "You're not just a businessman, are you? What's really going on here?" Charles' patience was wearing thin, but he refused to escalate the situation. "I'm on business," he replied firmly. "That's all. My attire or the nature of my work is none of your concern, unless you have a legitimate reason to detain me." Miller didn't like being challenged. He muttered something under his breath, then snatched at Charles's identification, his hand shaking slightly with frustration. The moment was rapidly growing more tense. The scene in the airport was starting to attract attention, but Charles remained calm, knowing that his actions now could determine whether this confrontation would escalate into something worse. The young officer, Davis, eyed him warily, unsure of how to proceed. The tension was now palpable, and as Charles simply stood there, waiting for the situation to be resolved, he knew that what happened next could very well change everything. As Charles stood there, waiting for Officer Miller to take his ID, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. It was an eerie feeling, one he was all too familiar with. As a man of authority in his own right, he had often been the one making decisions, not the one being questioned. But now, the roles had been reversed. There was something about this situation that felt off, more than just the obvious hostility. It was the way Officer Miller was looking at him, like he didn't belong, like he was an intruder in a place he shouldn't be. "I'll give you my ID," Charles said, his voice steady, but underneath there was a sharp edge that hinted at his growing frustration. "But I expect an explanation. I am entitled to one, and I won't just stand here and be treated like a criminal without knowing why." Miller gave him a cold look but said nothing. Charles could see the animosity simmering in his eyes, a clear sign that this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. Officer Davis, standing quietly beside Miller, shifted his weight uneasily. It was clear that Davis wasn't entirely sure what to make of the situation. He looked at Charles with a mix of suspicion and hesitation, but it was Miller who seemed determined to press on. Miller took the ID from Charles, barely glancing at it before looking back up at him. "You're from Virginia," he muttered, the judgment dripping from his words. "What are you doing in Chicago?" Charles didn't flinch. "Business," he replied, his tone calm but firm. "That's all. I'm not here for anything else. I don't need to explain myself any further." But the officer wasn't listening. The disdain in Miller's voice was unmistakable as he replied, "Business? Is that what you call it? You don't look like the type to be here on business. What exactly are you doing in a place like this?" It wasn't the question itself that irritated Charles. It was the tone, the way Miller was speaking to him, as if he were somehow out of place, as if his presence in this airport didn't belong. It was a tone that was all too familiar, the subtle racism that so many had faced but were often too afraid to call out. Charles took a slow breath, doing his best to keep his temper in check. He had learned long ago that losing control in these situations only made things worse. But the officer's words, his constant need to question Charles based on his appearance, were starting to push him closer to the edge. "This isn't the way this should be handled, officer," Charles said, his voice quieter but still laced with authority. "You're questioning me for no good reason. I've done nothing wrong. I'm just trying to get to my next flight, like everyone else in this terminal." Miller's expression tightened, but he wasn't ready to back down. Instead, he pushed further, his tone more aggressive now. "You think just because you have a suit on and a fancy job, you're above this?" he sneered. "You're just like any other suspicious person walking through this airport. Maybe you're trying to pull something shady. Maybe you're transporting something illegal. Who knows?" Charles felt the heat rising in his chest. The accusations were unfounded, and the more Miller spoke, the more he realized that this wasn't just about a routine stop. It was personal. Miller was treating him this way because of the color of his skin, not because of anything he had actually done wrong. "I'm not here to discuss your assumptions, officer," Charles said, his voice growing sharper now. "I'm asking you for a reason, not for a lecture. You have no right to treat me this way." Miller's face reddened, and for a moment Charles thought he might snap. But just as quickly, Miller seemed to regain control, though it was clear that his anger was simmering beneath the surface. "I'm not the one who's out of line here," he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for Charles to hear. "You're the one who's resisting." Charles felt a surge of frustration but fought to remain composed. This wasn't the time to let his anger take control. He had been through too much in his career, faced too many situations like this to let some small-minded officer get the best of him. "Resisting?" Charles repeated slowly, his voice icy. "I'm not resisting. I'm standing here asking you for a legitimate reason why you've stopped me. If you don't have one, then you need to let me go." At this point, Officer Davis seemed to be growing more uncomfortable. He glanced back and forth between Charles and Miller, clearly torn between his loyalty to his partner and his growing doubts about the situation. Davis opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Miller barked at him. "Shut up, Hayes," Miller snapped, his eyes still locked on Charles. "You don't get to question me." Davis fell silent, his posture stiffening. Charles could feel the dynamic shift, but it wasn't enough to change the course of the confrontation. The tension was building, and it was clear that this was about to escalate. "I'm done asking," Miller growled. "You're coming with us. We're taking you in." Charles's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the cold chill of handcuffs being readied, and in that moment he knew this wasn't going to end peacefully unless he made it end. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a power play. A move by Miller to show who was in charge, to exert control over someone he deemed out of place. But Charles wouldn't let it happen. As Miller lunged forward, trying to grab his arm, Charles instinctively reacted. He wasn't going to let these two officers drag him across the terminal. He stepped back, twisting out of Miller's grasp, his reflexes kicking in. "Don't touch me," he shouted, his voice firm, pushing back against the violence that was coming his way. In that instant, the situation went from bad to worse. Miller and Davis, now both involved, rushed toward him, attempting to restrain him. The struggle was swift and violent, with Charles fighting to keep himself from being overpowered, even as the crowd around them began to murmur, some pulling out their phones to record the chaos unfolding in the middle of the terminal. The two officers, fueled by their anger and racial bias, continued to try to overpower him, but Charles' experience kept him grounded. The moment was a reminder to him of the power imbalance in society, a painful truth that he had been forced to face time and time again. But as the struggle continued, Charles knew that the real fight wasn't just for his own freedom, it was for justice. The struggle escalates quickly as Charles finds himself violently restrained by the two officers. The cold click of handcuffs echoes through the crowded terminal as the officers slam him against the floor. Passengers nearby gasp, some recording the scene on their phones, others backing away in fear. Charles is stunned momentarily by the sudden shift from a simple conversation to full-on physical restraint. But even as the sharp pain from the cuffs digs into his wrists, he refuses to give them the satisfaction of seeing him react with anything but control. "Get off me," Charles growls, but his voice is swallowed by the cacophony around him. His body tenses against the restraining officers, trying to regain some semblance of control over the situation, but it's futile. The officers, younger and more aggressive, overpower him with ease. Their rough handling is a direct reflection of their unchecked power and their bias, which is becoming increasingly apparent with every passing second. As the struggle continues, the passengers in the terminal begin to murmur. their whispers filling the air. Some of them are confused, others are disgusted, but most are captivated by the spectacle unfolding before them. One phone camera zooms in on Charles's face, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to the chaos around him. His expression is unreadable, his eyes cold as he looks at the officers who have now got him on the ground. Officer Miller, standing over him with a smug expression, feels a brief sense of triumph. His hand grips Charles's arm tightly as he looks down at him with disdain. "You're resisting arrest. You're coming with us," Miller sneers, his tone dripping with superiority. Charles doesn't flinch. He's been in worse situations before, but this one feels different. The officers are acting on impulse, clouded by their own prejudice. And though Charles wants to lash out, he knows that giving in to their violence won't help anyone. His training kicks in. He's been through enough law enforcement encounters to know that the best response is to stay calm. That's why he doesn't fight back, even as his body is pressed roughly to the cold tile floor. The officer's grip tightens, and with an almost casual move he pulls out his phone, clearly eager to have some evidence of resistance in case the situation gets questioned later. But in that moment, it's clear to everyone who's watching that the only thing being resisted here is the racial profiling, the baseless accusations, and the utter disrespect for a man who has spent his entire life serving the country. Charles takes a deep breath, his chest rising and falling slowly, like he's absorbing the weight of what's happening around him. He is no stranger to the inequities of the system. He's seen it in the shadows of politics and law enforcement, in the whispers that follow him wherever he goes. But today, this isn't about him. It's about showing everyone, especially the officers, that they can't just silence someone because they feel threatened by their presence. The crowd around them grows, the tension in the air growing thicker by the second. The voices that had once been a distant hum are now focused, directed at the officers and their treatment of Charles. Some of the bystanders begin to speak out, questioning the officers' actions, while others turn their cameras on the scene. The realization is starting to dawn on them. They're witnessing something bigger than a random act of police brutality. This is a moment that's bigger than just Charles. It's about a system that has allowed this kind of behavior for far too long. But Charles remains silent, his face stoic despite the humiliation. He's not going to let this go any further. If the officers are hoping for him to crack, they're in for a rude awakening. The two officers continue their efforts, pushing him down, trying to get him to move into a more controlled position so they can arrest him, but Charles won't comply. He's not going to make it easy for them. The moment seems to last an eternity. The struggle between the officers and Charles rages on, but it's clear that Charles is not backing down. And that's when the unexpected happens. In a move that shocks everyone, Officer Hayes, who had been passively assisting his partner, hesitates. For just a split second, his eyes meet Charles's with something that can only be described as doubt. Hayes pulls back, his gaze shifting nervously from Charles to his partner Miller, as if he's suddenly realizing just how wrong all of this feels. "Stop! Stop it!" Hayes yells suddenly, his voice cracking with attention. "What are we doing?" His words cut through the air like a knife, and the officers stop, their hands frozen in place. Miller looks at Hayes, his expression darkening before he snarls in frustration. "We've got him. Don't let go," Miller growls. But Hayes is no longer listening. His resolve is fading. Then it happens. The crowd, now fully aware of what's going on, starts to shout. The murmurs grow louder, and a few people begin recording the scene on their phones. The whole terminal seems to be watching them, holding its breath, as Charles continues to stand his ground. In that moment, the officers realize they've crossed a line, but it's too late. Miller pulls his phone out, his expression sour, as if looking for a justification to explain his actions. But before he can make a move, Charles speaks again, his voice quiet but powerful, breaking through the chaos. "You have no idea who I am, do you?" Charles says calmly, his eyes locking with Miller's. The words send a chill through the officers. They stop in their tracks, and for the first time, they hesitate. Miller's grip on Charles loosens slightly, his confusion palpable. The tension shifts again. In that moment, Charles' words hang in the air, the weight of them so heavy that it seems to stop time. The crowd falls silent. Charles doesn't have to raise his voice. His presence alone is enough to make the officers second-guess their every move. And then, with all the power of his experience and position, Charles calmly reveals the truth that no one saw coming. "I'm Charles Reed," he says, "director of the FBI." The shock is instant. Miller's smug expression fades in an instant, replaced by a look of complete and utter disbelief. Hayes steps back, his face paling as the reality of the situation sets in. They had just arrested the head of the FBI. The shock on Officer Miller's face is palpable. His eyes widen and his mouth opens in disbelief, but no words come out. He takes an involuntary step back, his body trembling slightly as though the realization of what he's done has only just begun to settle in. The arrogance, the confidence he had carried only moments ago, evaporates in an instant. It's replaced by sheer panic. Charles Reed, FBI director, stands there, handcuffed, but with a presence so commanding that it almost feels like he's towering over the two officers. He doesn't flinch, doesn't react to their horror or desperation. His gaze is steady, unwavering, locked onto Miller, who is now grappling with the gravity of the situation. Hayes, standing beside his partner, looks as if he might collapse under the weight of his mistake. His face is drained of color, his hands shaking as they hover near the cuffs, unsure of how to undo the damage he's just helped create. The terminal, once full of murmurs and whispers, has now fallen into a stunned silence. A few passengers still record the scene, their phones capturing the shocking turn of events, but even they seem to sense the significance of what's happening. The man they had just tried to humiliate, arrest without cause, was not some random individual. He was Charles Reed, the most powerful figure in American law enforcement, and the weight of his identity hits the officers like a wave. Miller stumbles forward, his voice cracking as he tries to apologize, though it's too little too late. "Mr. Reed, Director Reed, I didn't know. We didn't know," he stammers, his words broken and frantic, desperately trying to salvage something from the disaster they've created. Charles doesn't even flinch at the officer's desperate apology. Instead, he straightens up, his posture stiff with authority. He doesn't need to say much. The sheer presence of his identity, the weight of his title, has already done more to break the officers than any words could. "I'm going to need your badge and your weapon, Officer Miller," Charles says, his voice calm but ice-cold. "And yours too, Officer Hayes. You've both just made a very serious mistake." The officers hesitate, their bodies stiff with terror, as they realize that the consequences of their actions are about to unfold in a way they never anticipated. They've crossed a line, and it's not just their jobs on the line now, it's their freedom. Hayes, the younger of the two, glances at Miller, but it's clear his partner has no idea how to handle this situation. Miller, still recovering from the shock, nods jerkily, his face now pale, drenched with sweat. He stumbles backward, his hands fumbling to remove his badge and gun, clearly unsure of what to do next. The silence in the terminal is deafening. All eyes are on Charles, and now on the two officers who are visibly crumbling under the pressure. Charles, still calm and composed, watches them closely, his gaze never wavering. He knows the power dynamics have shifted, but he won't let this moment slip away. He's been through enough to know that this kind of injustice doesn't just disappear. "Get the cuffs off me now," Charles demands, his voice unwavering. The younger officer, Hayes, reacts almost instinctively. His hands, shaking and uncertain, manage to grab the key from his belt, fumbling with it for several tense seconds. As the key turns in the lock, Charles can feel the rush of freedom returning to his wrists. The handcuffs slide off with a metallic click, but the sting from them lingers. Miller, now completely humiliated, can't even look Charles in the eye. He knows what he's done. They've gone too far. This is no longer a simple case of racial profiling or abuse of authority. This is a major scandal that's going to cost them both everything. Miller stumbles backward, his hands raised in what seems like a half-hearted attempt at appeasement. "Please, Mr. Reed," he pleads, his voice breaking. I didn't know who you were. This was a mistake. Please, don't. Charles interrupts, his voice low but carrying the weight of the authority he's always commanded. "You've just violated my rights, officer, and you've humiliated me in front of these people. But that's not even the worst of it. You've violated your oath to serve and protect. You've abused your power." Miller looks down at the ground, his shoulders sagging in defeat. Hayes stands beside him, frozen, too terrified to speak. The atmosphere in the terminal has completely changed. The crowd of onlookers, who had initially been recording and watching in shock, is now silent. Some look at Charles with admiration, others with fear, but all are aware that they've just witnessed a monumental moment of justice being served. But Charles doesn't gloat. He doesn't bask in their fear. He just stands there, his expression calm and authoritative. His thoughts are already moving beyond the moment. The officers have made their mistake, and now they will face the consequences, but Charles's focus is on something larger, systemic change. He's seen this kind of injustice before, in different forms, and he knows this isn't just about him. This is about accountability and ensuring that those who are supposed to protect the public are held to a higher standard. Just then, as if the tension in the air could no longer be contained, another figure enters the scene. A commanding voice cuts through the quiet. "What's going on here?" It's Lieutenant David Miller, the on-duty officer at O'Hare, a calm and composed figure in his early 40s with a no-nonsense attitude. His presence is felt instantly as he walks over to the scene, accompanied by two more officers. He assesses the situation in a matter of seconds, quickly putting together what has happened. He doesn't recognize Charles immediately, but he knows enough to realize that something went terribly wrong. The lieutenant's eyes scan the scene, and his gaze lands on the two officers. "Peterson, Hayes," he calls sharply, his voice authoritative. "What's going on here?" The two officers remain silent, and it's clear they're both panicked. Miller, now taking control of the situation, turns to Charles, his expression shifting from confusion to respect. "I'm Lieutenant Miller," he says, his tone much softer now. "I apologize for what's happened here. I understand you've been treated unfairly." Charles nods slightly, but his gaze remains firm. "This needs to be documented," he says, his voice steady. "I expect a full report. This isn't just about me. It's about ensuring accountability." As Miller orders the two officers to surrender their badges and weapons, Charles stands, free from the handcuffs, but the weight of the situation still presses on him. He's made his stand, and he knows what comes next. The consequences of these officers' actions will be far-reaching. Miller, though visibly shaken, tries to remain professional as he takes the officers to be suspended. Charles watches them leave, knowing the wheels of justice are now in motion. The fight for fairness, for equality, isn't over. But this moment, this powerful moment, has set the stage for change. The courtroom was tense as the trial of Officer Peterson and Officer Hayes progressed. In the front row, Charles Reed sat with an expression of quiet determination. He had already testified, recounting the brutal incident at O'Hare Airport with the precision and clarity of a man who had seen his fair share of injustice. But now, the moment of reckoning had come for the officers who had treated him as a criminal, solely based on his race. The room was filled with anticipation, every eye focused on the defense table where Peterson and Hayes sat, their once brash confidence replaced by a look of defeat. They had been exposed for their actions, and now the jury would decide their fate. The prosecution team, led by federal attorneys, had presented their case meticulously, using the damning body cam footage, the testimonies, and Charles's unwavering recollection of the events to paint a clear picture of abuse and racial profiling. The defense tried to downplay the severity of the situation, claiming the officers had acted under pressure, misunderstanding the circumstances, and insisting that the racial undertones of the arrest were simply misinterpreted. Their argument was weak, their words hollow in comparison to the overwhelming evidence stacked against them. But they had to try. It was their last chance. The defense attorney, a seasoned litigator, attempted to frame the arrest as a mistake, one made in the heat of the moment during a busy shift, and he appealed to the jury's emotions. "These officers are not bad men," he insisted. "They made an error in judgment, but they did not intend to harm anyone. This was an unfortunate situation that escalated out of control. They regret their actions deeply, and they've learned a valuable lesson." The words hung in the air, but they fell flat. The jury wasn't buying it. The body cam footage told a different story, one of arrogance, prejudice, and unchecked power. Peterson and Hayes had let their assumptions dictate their actions, and now they were facing the consequences. Charles, sitting in the witness stand, had been unwavering. His testimony was calm yet powerful as he explained how the incident had unfolded. He didn't seek vengeance, but instead he sought justice. Not just for himself, but for all those who had been subjected to similar treatment, those who had never had the chance to speak out. As he finished his testimony, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. The jury members exchanged glances, and the weight of what had been said seemed to settle over everyone. Finally, the defense rested, and the judge instructed the jury to deliberate. The wait was agonizing, the air thick with anticipation. Charles remained seated, his hands folded in front of him, his gaze fixed forward. He wasn't sure what the outcome would be, but he knew one thing for certain: this was a moment that would go down in history. Hours passed, and the courtroom was still when the jury returned. The foreman stood and read the verdict aloud, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the decision. "On the charge of civil rights violation under color of law, we, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Gary Peterson, guilty. On the charge of assault in the third degree, we find him guilty, and for Officer Ryan Hayes, we also find him guilty of the same charges." A collective gasp echoed through the room, followed by a murmur of disbelief. Peterson and Hayes sat motionless, their faces a mix of shock and despair. They had expected this, perhaps, but hearing it out loud made it real. They were going to pay the price for their actions. The judge, an experienced woman in her early 60s, leaned forward. "This is a serious offense," she said, her voice stern and unwavering. "These officers abused their power and violated the very trust that the public places in law enforcement. Their actions not only harmed the victim, Mr. Reed, but also undermined the integrity of the justice system." The sentencing was swift. The judge made it clear that no one, regardless of their position or rank, was above the law. "You have shown no remorse, only regret when your actions were exposed," she said, her eyes piercing through the two men at the defense table. "You betrayed the trust placed in you, and you will now face the consequences." She continued, "Gary Peterson, you are sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. Ryan Hayes, you too are sentenced to 6 years. This court will not tolerate the abuse of power, especially when it comes to the protection of civil rights." The words hit harder than any physical blow. Peterson's head dropped, and Hayes covered his face with his hands, overcome by the weight of their sentence. They had lost everything: their careers, their reputations, and their freedom, all because of their inability to see beyond their biases. Charles watched them carefully. His expression was calm, but there was a hint of something deeper in his eyes. Satisfaction, perhaps, or maybe just a quiet acceptance. He had fought for justice, and now it had been served. But even as the gavel came down and the officers were led away, Charles knew the fight wasn't over. The system had been exposed, but it was still far from fixed. As the courtroom emptied and people shuffled out, Charles remained seated for a moment longer, his thoughts distant. He had won this battle, but the war against racial injustice, against discrimination, was far from over. Charles stood, adjusting his suit as he prepared to leave. The weight of his position, of his duty, was heavier now than ever before. He had been the one to bring this case to light, the one to take a stand when so many others had turned a blind eye. But it wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been wronged, everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin or the way they dressed or their background. The battle wasn't over, but Charles Reed, FBI director, knew that with each victory, with each step toward justice, the world was moving a little closer to equality. He wasn't going to stop. Not now, not ever. As he walked out of the courtroom, his gaze steady and his shoulders squared, Charles knew one thing for sure: justice had been served today. But the work was just beginning. As the dust settled and the trial came to an end, Charles Reed stood tall, not with triumph, but with the quiet strength that comes from fighting for what's right. The journey had been long and exhausting, but the victory was more than just the conviction of 2 officers. It was a reminder that the fight for justice, for equality, and for the protection of civil rights is never truly over. The road is tough, and the system is flawed. But moments like this show us that progress is possible, no matter how difficult the path may seem. The real lesson in this story isn't just about the conviction of 2 corrupt officers. It's about standing up, speaking out, and never letting fear dictate your actions. It's about knowing your worth, understanding your rights, and holding those in power accountable, no matter their position or title. This is a story of resilience, of unwavering belief in justice, and of the courage it takes to face prejudice head-on and expose it for what it is. It's a call to action not just for those who face discrimination, but for all of us. We all have a role to play in creating a society where justice is truly blind, where racism and abuse of power are not tolerated, and where accountability is the rule, not the exception. As we wrap up this video, I want to hear from you. Do you believe that justice was truly served in this case? Have you ever had to stand up for your rights in a difficult situation? Drop a 1 in the comments if you think this video made an impact and helped shed light on a crucial issue. If you think there's more I can do to improve the content and make it more engaging, leave a 0 in the comments. Your feedback means the world to me, and it helps me create content that speaks to you. Thank you for watching. Let's continue this journey together, fighting for justice, equality, and a better tomorrow for all.